So here we have a manufacturing company whose relevant range of production is 6,000 to 9,000 units. That means it presently has the capacity to produce a number of units in this range, and its fixed costs will remain fixed in total, provided it stays within this relevant range of activity. We're also given per unit amounts for each of our costs. And we always need to be careful with fixed costs when they're expressed on a per unit basis, because remember, on a per unit basis, fixed costs will vary per unit, and so they're fixed in total, but the average cost per unit will change depending upon how many units we're dividing by. And these per unit amounts are based upon this level of production and sales, 7,000 units. So what I mean by that, and let's take a look at this $1.75 amount per unit for fixed manufacturing overhead. Someone calculated this per unit amount by taking total fixed manufacturing overhead and dividing by the 7,000 unit level that this figure is based upon. So dividing by the 7,000 units is how the $1.75 average fixed manufacturing overhead cost per unit was calculated. Therefore, to figure out what the total fixed manufacturing overhead cost was, we can work backwards and multiply $1.75 by 7,000 to get 12,250. And it will be very important to remember that this 12,250 total will remain fixed provided we stay within this relevant range of activity. So we can quickly figure out what our total fixed selling and total fixed admin expenses are too by multiplying these per unit amounts by 7,000 units. Now let's go ahead and answer question 1. If 8,000 units are produced, what are the total amounts of direct manufacturing costs incurred? So we have to pay attention to the wording in this problem. We're asked for total amounts, and we're asked just for direct manufacturing costs. So direct manufacturing costs include just direct materials and direct labor, because by definition, the manufacturing overhead costs are indirect. Therefore, we're only going to include direct materials and direct labor, and those are variable costs. We're going to use more direct materials and use more direct labor if we make more units of product. And since variable costs are fixed per unit, then we can add these together to get $995 total, and then multiply by 8,000 units, the total number we're assuming are being produced, and this answer of 79,600 represents our total direct manufacturing costs at this level of production. In question 2, 8,000 units again are being produced and sold, but now we're being asked for the total amount of variable costs. So not just variable manufacturing, but all variable costs. So we will include, again, the direct materials and direct labor, since those are variable costs. And now we're not just being restricted to just direct costs. We're being asked for total variable costs. So we're going to add to our direct materials and direct labor the variable manufacturing overhead. That's a variable cost. We're also going to add sales commissions, which are 75 cents per unit, and 25 cents in variable administrative expense. So the total of all those per unit variable costs, the total is 1170, and we'll multiply that by 8,000 units produced and sold to get our total variable costs. Now in question 3, we're asked if 9,000 units are produced, what are the total amounts of indirect manufacturing costs? So indirect manufacturing costs, that's going to be our manufacturing overhead. Since they're asking for manufacturing costs, we won't include any of the last 4 items in the table because those are all period costs. And since the question is asking just for indirect manufacturing costs, we will not include direct materials or direct labor. So just manufacturing overhead. Let's start with the 75 cents in variable manufacturing overhead. We'll multiply that by the 9,000 units being produced to get $67.50. And then we'll add the $12,250 in fixed manufacturing overhead, which we calculated up here, to get to our grand total of 19,000. A common mistake is to take the 75 cents in variable manufacturing overhead and add the $1.75 in fixed overhead and then multiply by 9,000 units. But that would be wrong because we have to remember the $1.75 up here in the table was based upon 7,000 units being manufactured and sold. And now we're selling and producing 9,000 units. So it's better to figure out first the total variable manufacturing overhead and then simply add in the total amount of fixed manufacturing overhead. Now in question 4, I didn't do one like this in class, so this will not be on the quiz. But here we're being asked for the total incremental manufacturing cost if the company increases production from 8,000 to 8,001 units. In other words, if they make one more unit, how much more will they have to pay to make one more unit? Well, the fixed costs, they're not going to change. They're going to stay fixed in total. The only extra amounts that will be incurred to make one additional unit of product are the variable manufacturing costs. And those are direct materials, direct labor, and variable manufacturing overhead. These 3 amounts add up to $10.70 per unit. So 1070 represents our incremental or extra out-of-pocket cost for manufacturing one more unit. And I didn't include any of the variable period costs because it's simply asking for incremental manufacturing cost. In question 5, it's asking if 6,500 units are produced, what is the average fixed manufacturing cost per unit? Again, we're being asked for just fixed manufacturing cost and on a per unit basis. So we're only going to look at fixed manufacturing overhead. We know what that total is. We figured that out earlier. Now we're going to divide by 6,500 units, the new level of production, to get to our new average fixed manufacturing cost per unit. In question 6, we're asked for the total amount of product costs incurred to make 8,500 units. This is just product costs, so we're only looking at manufacturing costs, and we want the total. We already figured out up here in question 4 that our variable product costs total 1070 per unit. So I'm going to multiply the 1070 by 8,500 units, to get the total amount of variable product costs. Then we'll add in the total fixed manufacturing overhead to get the grand total of product cost incurred to make 8,500 units. In question 7, it's asking for the variable cost per unit sold, and this is not restricting you to just product or just period. So it's asking for all the variable costs per unit. Well, we just figured out that $10.70 is the total per unit variable product cost. So we're going to go ahead and add the variable period costs as well, 75 cents in sales commissions and 25 cents in variable admin expense, for a total of $11.70 in variable costs per unit. Question 8, I noticed as I did this worksheet, is exactly the same as question 2. So I've repeated the answer here. In question 9, it says, if 7,200 units are produced, what is the total amount of fixed manufacturing cost incurred? Well, that total is the same as what we've already figured way up here at the top. Because remember, as long as we stay within the relevant range of production, the total amount of fixed manufacturing overhead cost will not change. It's $12,250. In question 10, it asks for the total amount of manufacturing overhead if 7,800 units are produced. So let's deal with the variable and fixed overhead separately. The variable manufacturing overhead is 75 cents per unit. We multiply that by 7,800 units produced to get the total variable manufacturing overhead. Then add the fixed overhead that we calculated previously to get our total. And part 2 of this question asks for the amount to be expressed on a per unit basis. So we'll divide by the 7,800 units to get our new average cost for manufacturing overhead, $2.32 per unit. And finally, last question, number 11. If 9,000 units are produced and sold, what is the total amount of period costs? Our period costs are the last 4 items in the table of data. Let's start with the variable period costs, the sales commissions, and variable admin expense. Those total $1 per unit. We'll multiply by the 9,000 units to get 9,000 in total variable period costs. Add the fixed selling that I calculated at the top of the page. I did that here. I also calculated total fixed admin. I've added both of those fixed expenses. And down here at the bottom, we have our grand total of period costs, $28,950. And finally, this last question, number 12, I shouldn't have included on this practice sheet. I haven't yet taught you contribution margin, and that will not be on the quiz, and so we can ignore that last question for now.